The CFA franc, which serves as the common currency of 14 African countries, is the highest level of French monetary policy in the region. Despite their widespread use, differences between banknotes from Senegal and Congo highlight the complex dynamics that underpin this currency union. While both currencies are linked to the euro, their distinctive appearances reflect the cultural and historical identities of the countries they represent. However, beneath these surface differences lies France's monetary control system, in which the French treasury determines the exchange rate of the CFA franc. This agreement gives France significant influence over the monetary sovereignty of these 14 countries, which have a population of nearly 200 million people. By managing the CFA franc, France has significant influence over the economic policies and development paths of its former West and Central African colonies. Critics argue that this system perpetuates a form of economic dependency, in which these countries' financial stability is determined by decisions made by the French government. The CFA franc issue encapsulates broader debates about post-colonial relations, economic autonomy, and African nation-state sovereignty, highlighting the region's ongoing complexities of international economic governance. Despite the appearance of global sovereignty and independence, many nations tied to currencies, such as the CFA francs, still face the legacy of imperialism in the form of economic control. While these countries have representation in international organizations, such as the United Nations, and fly their own flags, the fundamental mechanisms of economic dominance have largely remained unchanged. The sponsorship message embedded in this discourse ironically emphasizes this point by juxtaposing a discussion of imperialism with a commercial pitch for a video game. This clash demonstrates how modern forms of imperialism operate more subtly through financial institutions and economic policies than overt military force. Historically, imperialism was associated with military conquests and the spread of empires via tanks and military occupation. However, in the modern era, imperialism has adapted and evolved, primarily wielding power via financial systems and global economic structures. This shift has made it more difficult to identify and resist economic dominance, which can be disguised as financial assistance or partnership. The sponsorship message serves as a stark reminder of economic interests' pervasive influence on global dynamics, raising concerns about the ethics and consequences of modern forms of imperialism. It encourages reflection on how power is wielded and perpetuated in the modern world, shedding light on the complex interplay of economics, politics, and culture on a global scale. The transition from cowrie seashells to French currency as a medium of exchange in pre-colonial Africa to French colonial control of the money supply exemplifies a significant shift in economic dynamics and power relations. Cowrie seashells were a widely accepted form of currency in pre-colonial Africa, demonstrating the intricate economic networks that existed there. However, as European powers, particularly France, expanded their colonial reach into Africa, they sought to seize control of the existing economic systems in order to advance their own interests. The French Empire's imposition of French currency and trade monopoly disrupted traditional economic practices, subjecting African economies to the whims of colonial authorities. The imposition of taxes and the presence of armed troops in markets forced merchants to accept French currency, thereby consolidating French control over regional economic activities. This control included manipulating the money supply, with France dictating monetary policies and exploiting African labor and resources for its own economic gain. The unequal exchange of goods, with African raw materials sold below market prices and finished goods sold back to Africa at inflated prices, highlighted the exploitative nature of colonial economic practices. This historical context sheds light on colonialism's long-term impact on African economic disparities and power imbalances. Certain African nations' collaboration with France solidified their roles as custodians of France's neocolonial empire, particularly through participation in the Franc Zone and the hosting of French military bases. Guinea, on the other hand, refused to join the Franc Zone and insisted on its independence and self-determination. Despite intense pressure and retaliation from France, Guinea's leader, Sékou Touré, stood firm in his commitment to sovereignty, famously declaring that his people preferred poverty in freedom to riches in slavery. France's reaction to Guinea's rejection of the CFA franc was harsh and punitive. In order to set an example for Guinea and discourage other countries from following suit, France used coercive tactics, such as reducing war veterans' pensions, dismantling Guinea's power grid, and attempting to prevent Guinea from joining the United Nations. Furthermore, France engaged in nefarious schemes to destabilize Guinea's economy, such as causing hyperinflation through the circulation of counterfeit currency and funding armed anti-government resistance. Despite France's concerted efforts, Sécurité was able to maintain power, but Guinea's economy suffered long-term damage as a result of the retaliatory measures, demonstrating the high stakes and consequences of challenging neocolonial structures. The case of Togo's attempted departure from the CFA franc system in the 1960s sheds light on the lengths to which France went to maintain its grip on its former colonies' economies and quell dissent against neocolonial structures. When Togo's leader, Sylvanus Olympio, expressed intentions to abandon the CFA franc, he faced severe consequences. In January 1963, Olympio was assassinated in a coup d'état, a move widely suspected to have been orchestrated by French interests. However, official records regarding French involvement remain conspicuously closed, contributing to suspicions of covert French interference. Subsequent efforts to conceal French imperialism included restructuring the CFA franc system into two separate currencies for Central and West African states. While the central banks of these regions were ostensibly Africanized and relocated to Yaoundé and Dakar by the mid-1970s, France retained significant control through mechanisms such as maintaining veto power over key policy decisions. Despite the appearance of local representation within these institutions, fundamental policy changes were limited and French influence persisted, perpetuating a neo-colonial relationship that favored French interests over those of African nations. This case underscores the enduring legacy of French imperialism and the challenges faced by African countries in asserting genuine economic independence within the framework of the CFA franc. The fiscal policy that governs the CFA franc system imposes stringent requirements on member states, severely limiting their financial autonomy and perpetuating an economic dependency on France. One such requirement required member states to deposit a significant portion of their exchange reserves with the French Treasury, with half of their reserves and an additional 20% set aside for financial liabilities. This meant that member states only had access to 30% of their exchange reserves, severely limiting their ability to manage their own finances independently. Furthermore, the French Treasury monitored all foreign exchange transactions, effectively centralizing control over currency conversion processes. This centralization was facilitated by operations accounts, which were special accounts held by the French Treasury and denominated in euros. When member states' accounts were in credit, they effectively gave France access to their foreign exchange reserves. However, when these accounts were in debit, member states were required to pay interest to the French Treasury, exacerbating their financial burdens and reinforcing their reliance on French financial institutions. This arrangement perpetuated a cycle of economic subjugation in which member states were reliant on France to manage their financial resources, resulting in a system of economic exploitation and dependency within the CFA zone. The opaque nature of the financial dealings within the CFA franc system raises serious concerns regarding the use and management of member states' funds by the French Treasury. Despite member states depositing significant portions of their exchange reserves with France, the lack of transparency means that neither member states nor the public have clear insight into how these funds are utilized. This lack of accountability leaves room for speculation and raises questions about potential misuse or misappropriation of African funds by the French Treasury. Moreover, the asymmetrical nature of the CFA franc system benefits France economically, allowing it to potentially leverage African funds for its own profit. The absence of transparency regarding the destination and use of these funds creates an environment where France could conceivably reinvest African funding for its own financial gain. Additionally, the presence of numerous French multinational corporations in Africa further reinforces France's economic interests in the region. Companies like Total Energies, Areva, and Vinci stand to benefit from the stability and economic structures maintained by the CFA franc system, further entrenching France's economic influence and ensuring its continued profitability from African resources. France's economic interests in Africa go far beyond the monetary gains obtained through the CFA franc system. The continent provides critical strategic resources required to sustain France's industries and energy sectors. For example, uranium sourced from African countries such as Niger is critical to France's nuclear energy production, accounting for a significant portion of the country's energy requirements. Furthermore, Gabon supplies crude oil, Mauritania provides iron ore, and Togo and Benin export agricultural commodities, all of which are critical to France's industrial and agricultural sectors. In addition to natural resources, French influence in Africa includes critical infrastructure, as evidenced by the ownership of major ports by French nationals, such as Vincent Ballery. Control over key transportation hubs strengthens France's economic position in the region by facilitating the movement of goods and resources to and from Africa. Former French President Jacques Chirac's recognition of the significant financial gains derived from exploiting Africa emphasizes the economic significance of French involvement on the continent, as well as the extent to which French prosperity has been inextricably linked to African resources and labor. Furthermore, the CFA franc's configuration allows for easy repatriation of profits and capital. Between 1970 and 2010, Ivory Coast lost $40 billion in capital flight, which could have reduced poverty by 10% annually if reinvested domestically. Meanwhile, the main oil producers, Equatorial Guinea and Congo, transferred money equivalent to 43% and 30% of their respective GDPs from 2000 to 2009. Gabon and Cameroon show similar trends. Opulence at the top generates misery below. Though advocates point to the CFA franc's stability, a lack of monetary sovereignty restricts the tools available to the CFA member states. For instance, Ivory Coast's inflation rate is below 6% versus 29% in neighboring Ghana, but the latter's extreme poverty rate is only 13% versus 30% of Ivorians. The CFA member states also lag behind other African states' growth. Wise, some are even going backwards. Ivory Coast's real GDP per capita is 1/3 lower than in 1978. In 2016, Senegal was at its 1960 level. Meanwhile, Cameroon, Congo, and Gabon have not topped their respective peaks of 1986, 1984, and 1976. The stagnation of economic growth in CFA franc member states has been a persistent challenge for decades, characterized by limited development and dependence on French-controlled monetary policies. However, in recent years, there has been a notable shift in public discourse, with increasing discussions about alternatives to the CFA franc system. This growing trend reflects a recognition among societies in these countries that change is imperative for achieving meaningful economic progress and asserting greater sovereignty over monetary affairs. Therefore, there is a natural synergy in the ECOS region. Of course, nothing worth having is easy. Paris has tried to thwart these attempts. In January 2021, the French Senate passed numerous measures to this effect. It intends to convert the West African CFA franc into the ECOS, then abolish the operations accounts and remove French personnel from the central banks. All of this is expected to be completed by 2027, but Paris will retain effective control over where African monetary reserves will be held, which remains undetermined. The French reform is clearly a ruse. Finally, the best solution may be for individual states to have their own central banks and currencies tied to a common regional unit at a variable rate. This would grant monetary sovereignty to 14 nations, or nearly 200 million people. But many people are still afraid to cross swords with France, and for good reason. As a result, any attempts to break free from French hegemony would necessitate a coordinated effort across the CFA franc zone. Most importantly, the African collaborating elites who benefit from the system would have to be replaced by lawmakers willing to pursue self-directed development. This could be the most difficult stumbling block, and it must be changed from within, because there is nothing more agreeable in life than accepting the status quo, but nothing more corrupting. Thanks for watching till the end. Catch you in the next video.